into the pandemic, and it seems like we are still lurching from crisis to crisis. Or should that be variant to variant? The good news, of course, is that almost everyone now accepts that we have to live with the virus. Countries are reopening, travelers are ready to go whenever and wherever possible. And so today I'm going to start with a brief overview of where we see the market going here at Phocuswright. And then we're going to look at some trends that we've been observing and overlay those with what consumers are telling us. And that way we can set the stage for our industry to take advantage of the recovery that is in front of us. It's so, so close. So let's just look at the global travel bookings and how we see those panning out over the next few years. Now, travel growth was slowing a little bit, going back to 2018, 2019. And in 2019, we saw global travel bookings of over $1.4 trillion. Of course, we all know how 2020 went. But there were signs of recovery in 2021, especially on the domestic front. And in 2022, we project that gross bookings will be back to $1 trillion again. That's a benchmark that we last saw during the Great Recession. So it'll be great to reach that so quickly. And just looking at how fast we expect travel to come back, we expect that the compounded annual growth rate, the CAGR from 2020 through 2024, will be over 25%. And by 2024, we will be back to just under the highs that we saw in 2019. Of course, one pandemic-related effect that we saw is that people turned to online channels for pretty much everything in their daily life. It was a necessity, but that also created an increased level of comfort with online shopping. Now, in travel, that's reflected in the jump in online penetration. So in 2020, more than half of global travel, even though it was small, was booked online. The US saw a big jump. About 56% of bookings in 2020 were made online. That slightly exceeded the level in Europe. But we do expect the US to moderate down as the segment mix goes back to normal. Europe will reach about 60% online penetration by 2024. That's the highest globally. But if you're talking about growth, the online growth that we see in APAC, that trajectory is up about 25 points since 2015, and we expect it to reach 58% in 2024. As for Latin America, online growth has been steady, but it does lag a little bit. From 39% in 2019 to 42% in 2020, and a projected 48% by 2024. What does that mean on the dollar side? Well, online gross bookings were about half of all travel bookings in 2019. They declined a little less than the total market. They fell about 57% in gross dollar terms in 2020. And we expect to see that online will grow faster. So the CAGR is about 27.5%. And by 2024, the total value of travel booked online will exceed 2019 levels and reach $761 billion. Okay, so we know that a recovery is in the offing. That doesn't mean that we're going to go back to things as they were before. Traveler behaviors and expectations have changed. So what should the industry be cognizant of so that we can take appropriate actions to accelerate the recovery? Well, we know the pandemic had a really dramatic impact on short-term travel plans, but it also reinforced people's desire to travel. And travel has always been a great unifier across the globe. Even during the pandemic, consumers consistently wanted to get out of their homes, to see family, to visit new places. And travel remains an important part of most people's lives. And we see that reflected in the incidence of travel across the US and in key European markets. So, incidence is the percentage of the population that took a trip during a particular year. So, in 2020, even with the limits that were imposed on movement, These numbers show us just how strong that interest in travel remains. When people could travel, they did travel. Nearly half of the US population took a trip in 2020. In Europe, that ranged from about 42% in the UK to 51% in Spain. And in fact, travel remained at the top of the priority list when we asked consumers how they were spending their discretionary income. Now, the inherent risks of COVID did mean that a few things changed. The pandemic has really altered the landscape for how we travel, and travelers have adapted their behaviors to fit the situation. Let's start with booking behavior. Online remains the preferred booking method overall. 3 in 5 travelers tell us that they usually or only book travel online. But what we saw was that the offline customer service representative was really appealing in the last year compared to some previous years. With the changing rules and policies, travelers were nervous and they felt that offline channels were better able to inform them of what's going on. So, a significant proportion of consumers considered booking offline. They wanted to talk to someone who could guide them, who could tell them what was going on, what the restrictions were, what testing was required. And especially in Spain, a whopping 67% of travelers said they considered offline booking. And when it came to choosing where to go, well, COVID really was the great benefactor for the outdoors. Outside settings were touted as safer environments than being indoors. We saw travelers flock to beaches, to ocean destinations, they went hiking, and they went to smaller towns where the crowds were perhaps a little less than the big city. They also went to urban locations, just not as much as in previous years. And looking forward, outdoor destinations will continue to benefit from heightened traveler interest. That doesn't mean that cities have been abandoned, though. Ultimately, interests remain truly diverse, even in pandemic times. Talking about destinations, we saw travel and work blend during the pandemic, whether that's working from home or simply making the most of being able to work from anywhere. Countries and destinations have also been trying to attract travelers with various schemes, incentives. It's been a great way to generate some tourism dollars, much needed, of course, during the downtimes. For workers, the benefits of flexibility have also come to the fore. But are these digital nomads who we think they are, or are we really just stereotyping? Generally, when we talk about nomads, what comes to mind is a freelancing millennial who's constantly on the road, looking for exotic locales to take pictures, living their best life and bragging about it on Instagram. But with the fundamental shift to work from anywhere that we saw over the last 20 months, people could fulfill their responsibilities without having to be in a single location. So a new category of employees has emerged, and it's revolutionized what it really means to be a digital nomad. What we see is that nomads actually span a wide age range. They're employed full time, they're highly educated, high earners, they're quite senior in their careers too. And they have significant others, they have kids. Now, companies, of course, are still grappling with the issue of whether to force employees to go back to the office or to offer remote options. Many have decided they'll go down the hybrid route. We know from our data that employees actually prefer the flexibility of working from anywhere. So, this new nomad is here to stay. And the travel industry really needs to make sure that they cater to this wide group of people. When it comes to flexibility, what we saw was initially when the pandemic started, cancellations really outpaced new bookings, naturally. And travel suppliers and intermediaries actually allowed that flexibility in terms of changing tickets or canceling tickets and offering refunds. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but also because they had no choice. That's created an expectation among travelers, which is largely carried through the last 20 months. Over two-thirds of travelers in the US and Europe say that it's more important to have flexible cancellation, rebooking, or refund policies now, especially European travelers. And in Europe, we've seen governments have been very quick to shut down anytime there's a surge in cases, and there's often very little notice. Ultimately, travelers just want to ensure that they can change their plans based on the prevailing conditions and any health concerns. And some travelers, not all, but some, are definitely willing to pay for it, either through soft means or through hard dollars. Nearly half of US travelers say that they would join a loyalty program, just under half would use a particular credit card, and slightly under a third would be willing to pay an extra fee if it means that they get some flexibility to change their plans. In Europe, that willingness to pay is slightly less, but even there, as many as 2 in 5, that's 40% of travelers in some cases, say they'll pay an extra fee for the flexibility. Now, one thing we've all heard through the pandemic is this surge in contactless technology. It's becoming ubiquitous, and it's really changing the travel experience. Safety and security, of course, is top of mind for travelers, and what contactless technology does is it helps facilitate a more secure environment. We're seeing implementations of these technologies throughout the customer journey. Airports, airlines, hotels, restaurants, payments, everything is going contactless. And it was seen pre-pandemic too, but what's happened is this trend is really accelerated now. In the near to midterm, travelers want to have less interaction throughout their trips. They're now more comfortable with using biometrics. And all of that combined will lead to less friction during the trip. Close to two-thirds of travelers in the US and Europe say they prefer using contactless options during their trip, and it helps them avoid face to face interactions. Now, if that facilitates a smoother journey, they'll stick as travelers become used to it. So the novelty is gone, the convenience factor comes in. Now, before the pandemic, when we talked about privacy, a lot of conversations centered around online behaviors, about how our data was being collected by companies, how it was being used, how it was being protected. During the pandemic, what we've seen, and especially so after vaccines have come into the picture, is that that privacy conversation has shifted to talking about health data. When it comes to the measures that travelers are willing to take to travel, there are some distinct limits to what they're willing to do. So, wearing masks, maintaining social distancing protocols, that's okay. Testing, vaccination, also okay. Most travelers agree these are reasonable requests given the risk. But when it comes to doing things that might require providing information about medical history or being tracked during the journey, installing an app for contact tracing or tracking people in destination, there's a little bit of hesitancy about the willingness to do that, even if it means that that's what enables them to travel. So that conversation around privacy, while contactless tech was quickly adopted in the early stages and governments started tracking and tracing to try to control the spread of the virus, that was a necessity. But once we have some measure of control, and now that countries are starting to implement policies requiring a vaccination record or a test record in order to access destinations or public transport or even enter certain venues like stadiums and restaurants, that's where people are really starting to tell us that they find it invasive, especially in Europe. Now, talking about those who are still a little hesitant to travel, many of them are monitoring the key indicators and initiatives that'll instill confidence and calm their fears. For most people who are not yet ready to travel, a combination of some of these factors is enough for them to gain that confidence and restart traveling. On the international front, though, they tell us they're still hesitant to take that step. Infection rates are a vital indicator for safe travel. Personal vaccine status, that's not the only consideration. Travelers, and especially those in older age groups, tell us that they are seeking out environments where peers are also vaccinated. And for businesses, measures like no mandatory quarantines are a prerequisite to allow their employees to travel without any problems. And that's going to be a factor when it comes to restarting business travel. Now, travel and tourism is an important economic activity globally, but we know we contribute to global climate change. And we have to strike a balance between the interest of travelers, the welfare of the environment, preservation of culture, the economic development of destinations. The pandemic has represented an excellent opportunity for us to rebuild with sustainability at the forefront. And while businesses and governments have a great deal of power to make a large impact, every stakeholder needs to do their part. Travelers are aware of this. They know they need to contribute to sustainability efforts. And some actions are already underway, but others will perhaps take a little bit of time. Now, in Europe, travelers tell us that they are actively seeking out local food options. When it comes to transportation, more than 40% say that they'll fly less. A third are still saying that they'll seek out rail options. And lodging also. Eco friendly lodging options are on the traveler radar, though acceptance is still a little lower than where we'd like to see it. And suppliers are taking action as well, whether that's airlines, which are turning to alternative fuels, or hotels reducing water usage, tours and activities with a low carbon footprint. Attitudes are changing for travelers and for suppliers. So, what now? Well, in the near to midterm, we expect a lot more twists and turns. The travel industry has no choice but to remain nimble because variants will come and go, but the pandemic we know is here to stay. Travelers will continue to take every opportunity to travel, but till we get to coordinated global action from governments, the industry has to be prepared to deal with uncertainty. Those who are quick to react and have plans in place will thrive. And we know in the long term, there is no doubt that travel will be back. Thank you.